On Friday, I was had a pretty full day, not overwhelming, but it was a pretty full day of meetings and connections with people. And you know how sometimes when you have a day like that, and lots of your lives look like that, your day is basically spent with people, going from one meeting with people to another meeting with people. And sometimes it doesn't quite go the way you want, and it goes a little longer than you want. Usually, I found it doesn't go shorter. But I had kind of scheduled my day out, and towards the end of the day, I was trying to get to the gym, and I needed to be done with the gym at 5, but so I needed to get there at a certain time, and I just because of meetings, it was like I was barely going to make it, and I was talking last week about trying to ruthlessly remove hurry from my life, which hasn't happened yet, but it's only been a week, so give me a minute. So anyway, I get to the gym, and the gym that I go to is, it's a kind of a quirky gym. I love it. I've been going there for 25 years, but you get in with a key card, and so, you got the key card, and usually you got your stuff, and I got to the gym, and I was trying to get in. I backed in my car and got parked, and I was headed towards the door, and there was a guy about 20 yards ahead of me or so. I was kind of at the end of the parking lot, and he was right at the door going in, and I thought to myself, well, I'm still going to have to get my card out because he's too far ahead of me, and he's going to go in, and the door will close, and then I'll have to get my card out and go in. And so he got to the door, and he opened the door, and then he turned around and he looked at me, and I thought, oh no, he's going to hold the door. Now I have to rush. I was like, and so I grab my stuff and I lock my car up and I kind of start to jog up a little bit. And he looks at me and he kind of makes eye contact. And again, he's probably, as far as from here to the back row of chairs. And he looks at me and he makes eye contact with me and he said, "You don't have to rush." It was just like this gift had been. I didn't rush. And I didn't tell him, my life story. Thank you. I'm trying to ruthlessly remove hurry from my life. So, but I didn't, I stopped, and then I walked, and he just stood there, and he just held the door until I got there, and I walked in. How's your day? Good. And it struck me that was a real act of kindness to me. It was just this moment when it was like, I'm not in any hurry, and you don't have to run, I'll be here holding the door when you get here. And I think it hit me because I've been thinking a lot about, what does God have for us in 2020? What's God's vision for us in 2020? And wouldn't it be interesting if God's only goal for us in 2020 was kindness? Like if his only goal for us was to live out the gospel and to love the people that we have contact with, to love the people that we have opportunity to relate to. Wouldn't it be weird if the God of the universe, who made everything you can see, who made the intricate details of plants and people and animals and all of the universe as it is, wouldn't it be odd if the God who's that big actually just would like us to be good to each other? That seems like a too small goal for God and for God's people. But wouldn't it be interesting if God's heart for us as we walk this coming year out is just that we would be good to each other, that we would love each other? Could it be that simple and awful at the same time? Right? Think about it. It's like, well, yeah, that's easy enough. Is it? Is that easy enough in this culture where we live? Because people are not very kind to each other. People aren't very good to each other in this culture. And there's lots of ways, because of all of the way technology has grown and because of the way the world is changing, there have been new ways devised to not like each other. There have been new ways devised to needle each other and be unkind and ungracious and hateful. But I was thinking about, again, what's God have for us in 2020? And as I was away a few weeks ago, I got up in the morning and I just flipped open my iPad and I went to my Bible app, and the verse of the day was this verse that we know so well, right? Or at least you probably do know it, or you've heard it. It's in Micah chapter 6. Micah chapter 6, verse 8. And it goes like this: He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Like, it's almost like, this is all God's looking for from you. In some ways, it's do justice, love mercy, and to walk in humility. I kind of like Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of this text from the Message. He says it this way, but he's already made it plain how to live and what to do, what God is looking for in men and women. It's quite simple. Do what's fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in your love, and don't take yourself too seriously. Take God seriously. And so when we think about that, I want to just take us back to revisit these words again. These words that we get in Micah 6:8, right? The three words that he gives us, justice, mercy, and humility. These are the three words that are key in Micah chapter 6:8. And so what does it look like? What does justice look like? Well, justice is to act equitably, to not hurt anyone by word or deed. Justice is to behave equitably, and to do no harm by word or deed. And so God's challenging his people in this text through the prophet Micah. You need to pay attention to this thing that I've asked you to do. Here's all I'm asking from you. Justice, mercy, and humility. And God is kicking against what he sees already in his people. He's talking about this because he hasn't seen this. And even Micah kind of lets us know what God had seen. If you go back in Micah to chapter 2, just flip back towards the front to chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it. It's like, woe to those people who lay awake at night thinking about how to be mean to others, and as soon as they get up, they get on with it. Like, they're devising evil plans as they lay awake at night. And they get up in the morning, they get on with it. Because it is in the power of their hand to do it. You think about, C.S. Lewis talks about how incredible human persons are and how also awful that means they are, or can be, right? Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it's in the power of their hand. They covet fields and they seize them, and houses, and take them away. They oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. He's saying, you guys aren't treating each other justly, not fairly. Somebody who has the power to take away something from someone else, they're actually using their power. They're doing that. They're oppressing those who are weaker. They're taking away that which is available for them to take away. Even though it's not right for them to do it, that's what they're doing. And so there's no justice there. Verse 8 of chapter 2, but lately my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich robe from those who pass by trustingly, with no thought of war. You know, you take advantage of the person who comes up to you, and they come up to you with a good heart, with a trusting heart, and you take away that which is theirs when they're not even recognizing what's about to happen. Micah chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. And I said, hear, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, it is not for you to know justice. Is it not for you to know justice? Don't you know what justice is? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones. It's like, I'm looking for people who will be good to others. Justice. Justice is to behave in a way that's equitable. Justice is to behave fairly with the people around us. It's not to take advantage of every opportunity that we have to take something from someone that we have the power to take, even if we don't have the right to take it. Behave with justice. And then love mercy. Mercy is to be guided in conduct to others by loving kindness. It's like to be guided in relationship to others by loving kindness, to look on other people and to love them. That's the whole duty that we have to our neighbor, right? When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That covers it. Jesus said, that's it. If you do those two things, you will have taken care of all of the law. And if you miss those two things, none of the rest of it matters. You can read that into the text, and also we'll see it in other places. Jesus, what do you think is the most important thing for us to do? Love God with everything you are, love your neighbor as yourself, and if you do that, you don't have to worry about much else. And so it's not hard to see how we might come to the conclusion that what God desires from us more than anything else this year and every other year of our lives is to be good to each other, to love each other, to show mercy to each other. You know, we compare what's going on here and the heart of the people in Micah to what we see in Jesus in Matthew chapter 23 when he's talking to the religious leaders. It's these religious leaders that God's trying to get a hold of back in the book of Micah, right? In 23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Those you ought to have done without neglecting the others. He said, yeah, you've got all the rules right. You're meticulously taking your herbs and you're parting a tenth of them out, and you're making sure you give those to me, but you forgot what I really care about, and that's justice and mercy. These are the weightier matters of the law. I'm going to get by with only 8% of your mint, but I can't get by with you not living out the very core and essence of who I made you to be. So we think about mercy. It's care for others. It's to give help to those in need and those who are distressed. It's to live in the world with eyes that see others rightly. The Hebrew word that we get here is chesed, and the word actually means more loving kindness. There are multiple words in Scripture for mercy. This word really is more steadfast love, loving kindness, unfailing love. Larry talked about that. It was great. And I'm going to move into some of the texts that Larry was talking about during his communion time. God has loved us with this unfailing love. That's what Micah says. He has shown you what's good and what God requires of you. It is to do justice, and it's to love others with an unfailing love, the sort that you were loved with. That's what I'm looking for from you, God says. It kind of reflects the heart of God's love in Psalm 106. Remember, there are some psalms that you get this repetitious thing, right? And in Psalm 106, because his steadfast love is everlasting. His steadfast love is everlasting. We don't want to forget that. These are the characteristics of who God is, but primary within those characteristics are an unfailing love, a love that's everlasting, that never changes, that endures forever. And that's the word that he uses here when he uses the word chesed. Like, it's unfailing love. It's not just being nice to people. It's actually loving people unconditionally, unfailingly, enduringly. That's what God says, that's what I'm looking for from you. And then humility. What is it to walk humbly? It's like to walk in humility. Well, it means more than just like talking lowly about yourself. It means to live and to act in a way that understands clearly who you are. It's to live and to act out a life of humility. To be careful how you see yourself. Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12 that you don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, right? But to think of yourself with sober judgment. Have a clear view of yourself. Have a clear view of yourself. That's humility. That's where it begins. Isaiah chapter 6, you probably remember that text in Isaiah where Isaiah says, "Woe to me! I'm a man of unclean lips, and I'm living around unclean people." Verse 5, "Woe to me, I'm lost, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." What's Isaiah saying here? He's saying, I see myself in contrast to who God is. And when we see ourselves in contrast to who God is, we understand that the magnificence of His glory is so far beyond who we could be that we can't do anything but live in humility. We can't do anything but live in humility. And we see this characteristic in Jesus, right? We see this characteristic in Jesus who He says in in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, he says, walk the way I walk. Take my yoke upon you and carry my burden, which is humility and meekness. Behave like me. See me. And then follow my pattern of walking out in the world humility and meekness. Again, sometimes we see those characteristics, humility and meekness, as weak characteristics. And so if you want to be powerful in the world, you can't behave weak. You need to not walk with humility. You need to walk with strength and power. And you need to let people know who you are. Let people know what your position is. And Jesus says, no, it's actually the opposite of that. If you want to be seen as a person with some sense of power or some sense of real greatness in your life, the best way to do that is to be humble. Sometimes we haven't done this in a while as a family, but we get together, as a family and like around Christmas or Thanksgiving, and sometimes we would play games, and sometimes it would be the men against the ladies, and I never liked that because it usually teams me up with my brother, who I love and who's tons of fun. But as soon as the game starts, he starts wagging his tongue, right? It's like, oh yeah, well we're gonna, I just think, okay, we're out. We're going to beat you guys. We're going to be great. This is going to be amazing. We're going to just, wipe the floor up with you. And I think, well, that's it. We're not going to win this one. It's almost like, you're just not going to, it's like, just stop. Let's just win. Because I want to win. Not that I'm competitive, but I want to win. So stop acting that way because God's opposed to the proud. There's nothing more futile than to be opposed by God. Stop. But when you see a person of depth and substance, they're not the person who's trying to push their way to the front of the line. Generally speaking, the people that we admire, I think, are the people who are listening carefully and the people who are not pushing themselves to the front of the line. We see it in Jesus' teaching when the disciples in Mark chapter 9 are saying, hey, who's the most important? And Jesus said, you want to be the most important, be the least. You want to be the greatest in the kingdom, then serve. That's how it works. So you see, Jesus brings this whole new thing. It just turns the whole system of the world on its head. He's watching the religious leaders who are lording their power over other people, and he says that's not what power looks like in the kingdom of God. It is to walk with humility. Jesus says in Luke 14, whoever humbles himself will be exalted, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled. We have so many scriptural references to this, right? Don't take the chief seat at the banquet. Don't be the guy who gets, I think I'm going to sit at the head of the table. Don't be that person because sometimes the host will come in and say, yeah, that's actually someone else's seat. You don't get to sit there. They'll move you down. Sit at the lowest seat. Maybe they'll move you up and maybe they won't. But you lose nothing if you sit at the lowest seat and you don't get moved up. It's really awful if you sit at the highest seat and get moved down. So pay attention to what you're looking for. Humility is that sense of not needing to push ourselves to the front of the line. One of the best pictures of it that we get is in Philippians chapter 2, right? And if you want to be like Jesus, have the mind of Jesus, who though he existed in the form of God and he was equal with God, he emptied himself. It's a great word, right? That he emptied himself. This picture of saying, I could sit at the front of the line and no one would move me, but I'm going to sit at the back. I could take authority, but I won't. And that's why we see like in John chapter 13, and Jesus, knowing that all authority had been given to him, knowing who he was, it wasn't a question of his being like, oh, I'm not sure about myself. It wasn't that. And Jesus, having been given all authority and knowing exactly who he was, put on a towel and started washing the feet of the disciples. Probably no one said, there's a weakling. Humility. It's a matter of taking a step back and not pushing ourselves to the front of the line. I think C.S. Lewis says it kind of like this, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, humility isn't thinking lowly of yourself. Humility is just not thinking of yourself much at all. Not thinking lowly of yourself, like, oh, woe is me, I'm an awful person. And sometimes, we can be that way. But he's saying, no, it's not that. It's just not thinking of yourself much. It's looking outward instead of looking inward. And so when we revisit these words that Micah gives us in this text of justice, to behave equitably, to do the right thing when you're in relationship, and mercy, to have unfailing love for others, and humility, to think of yourself with right view, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, and also not to think of yourself more lowly than you should think. This isn't like we condemn ourselves and we live in this place of self-condemnation, like I'm an awful person, woe is me, because I'm never going to make it. Sometimes we do that. It's kind of phony, and it's not a good idea. It's not what he's asking for from us, but to see ourselves with a proper view. And so what we see in this is that what God's looking for from us as his people in the world and in our relationships with each other is that we live with this highest characteristic of love for each other. And we live in relationship to our world with a high degree of love and mercy and justice and humility. And so let me just invite you to think about, where are the places that your life connects? And is your life reflecting in those places that you connect in ways that reflect justice and mercy and humility? At work, at school, in relationships with your neighbors, or in relationships with your family, in relationships to the really hardest people you have to put up with in your life. I know there are some. We all have people that we struggle to wander along with. And so, sometimes it's easy to have this sense of, if they were better or different, then it would be easier for me to love them. I wonder if God ever says that about us. Boy, if those guys weren't so knuckleheads, they'd sure be easier to love. I don't know if he thinks it or if he says it to the Trinity, but it would be true if we weren't so difficult. But God's chosen to love us in this way. And so we revisit the primacy of love in Scripture, the degree to which God says over and over to us, all the way from the beginning of Scripture to the end, be good to each other. He repeats this idea that I desire mercy rather than sacrifice. And this is an important concept, because he tells us in Micah chapter 6, before he gets to verse 8, he tells us what he's not looking for from his people. Right? If you look at Micah back to verses 6 and 7. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Now, here's the odd thing. God actually did say that. There was a system of sacrifice that God put in place. Right? And they behaved this way. And when the temple was working, they were offering sacrifices, and they were bringing their calves and their goats and all that sort of stuff. But here God says, what do you want? What am I looking for when you come before me? Is it a burnt offering? Is it with perfect calves a year old? No. No, it's not that It's not that he changed. He just said, that's not mostly, if you're bringing all that, but you're missing this other piece, then you're still missing everything. Verse 7, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? God doesn't have a lot of need for rams and calves and oil. Have you thought about that? Like, in our culture, like money, Moses Lake Christian Church, we'll have an offering time today, and you might put some offering in there. And we don't, in some ways we don't talk about that even enough. But the reality is, when you bring that, it's not like God's like biting his fingernails and hoping enough money comes in, because I'm not going to be able to keep this kingdom running without the offering. I mean, it's really important to us, and we really are grateful for your faithfulness and the way that people give to this church. And year after year after year, we've seen God's faithfulness. You think about this building, and I sat down with Bob Trask this week, and he's our insurance guy, and he said, well, here's the value of this property and this building. And you go, wow, it's incredible. We can't afford this. But God has been generous to us. But the reality is, if we're bringing all of our money, and we're like really the most generous person in the church, but we forget the thing about love. We actually missed it. He's not like cheering us on, like, hey, you're awful at loving, but thanks for the dough. It's just not his heart. And shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Lots of religions at this time of the world, and lots of religions throughout history, have practiced human sacrifice, and often child sacrifice, It's happened. God says, is that what you think I'm looking for? Am I looking for you to bring your firstborn? No, that's not what I'm looking for. Well, what are you looking for? Well, I'm looking for this. I'm looking for justice and mercy and humility. That's what I'm after. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12. What is the Lord looking for from you? It's the keeping of the law and all that stuff? No, I've asked you to do that. But what I'm looking for is mercy and sacrifice and justice. We talked last week about John chapter 15 and fruit bearing in 2020. And Jesus says that if you abide in me and I in you, then you'll bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. But what is the next thing that Jesus talks about when he's in that text? What's the next thing John records Jesus talking about in John 15? It's love. Right? I want you to abide in me and I'll abide in you. And if you abide in me, you're going to bear a lot of fruit. And that's going to bring glory to God. Right? Verse 11, John 15, these things I've spoken to you that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. When your life is reflecting the fruit of God, it brings joy to your life. And the next step in this parade is, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I've loved you. How has he loved us? Unfailing love, unconditional love, steadfast love, everlasting love. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You're my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant doesn't know what his master's doing, but I've called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I've made known to you. You didn't choose me. I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father, it may be done for you. I chose you to bear fruit, and this is what the fruit looks like. The fruit looks a lot like love. And then Paul, you think about the great text in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul reiterates really what Jesus says in 1 Corinthians 13. Notice that Paul uses kind of this pattern, actually that Micah uses also. It's not an uncommon pattern, right? Follow me in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You probably don't even need to turn there. You probably know it by heart or mostly. Paul says this, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If you're the most eloquent preacher in the world, but your life doesn't reflect love, you're just noise in the world. Just noise. Nobody sees it. Nobody feels it. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all the mysteries and have all knowledge and I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but don't have love, I'm nothing. It's not going to matter, Paul says. Think about, again, go back to Micah. What do I want from you? Is it the first-year-old calves that are coming as a burnt offering? Is it thousands of rams and rivers of oil? Is it your firstborn? No. What I'm looking for is love and mercy, justice, humility. And if we don't see that, then we haven't seen anything. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. This is what God's after in us. And so I just want to invite us to think about, as we launch into this year, are our lives reflecting the sort of love that brings honor to God? That He would look at and go, that's it, you're getting there. Not that we have to do it to earn His love, because we already know we don't. But what He say about us, you've hit the nail on the head. Well, good news for us, we can know when we're doing it. Because He goes on in 1 Corinthians and says these things. Love is patient and it's kind. Love does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. You want to know the sort of leaders that God is pleased with? They reflect these characteristics: patience and kindness and gentleness. Not arrogance, not rudeness, not insisting on its own way, not irritable or resentful. Now, we all fall into those things. I hope so, because I do. I would like to think I'm not the only one. And I know most of you, so I'm not too worried that I'm the only one. But see, He actually tells us what love is, what it looks like. He gives us a description. We don't, I would really love to love people, but if I just knew what it looked like, well, here it is. This is the character that God is looking for from His people. This is what he wants. He wants our lives to reflect those qualities of love. And Larry was talking about 1 John, and he's so right about this. You want to know what love is? Go to 1 John. Read the whole thing. You'll get tired of the word. Start in verse 7, 1 John chapter 4. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. You see, our lives begin to reflect what we care most about. And when our lives are focused on God, His love begins to permeate it, and that's what flows out of us. If our lives are fixated on money, if what we love the most in the world is money, that's evident too, right? Because what flows out of us is greed and give me more and earning more and having more and pursuing more and taking what's not yours. If we love things, then what will flow out of us is greed and grasping. But if we love God, what will flow out of us is love. That's what spills out of us. And so if we know God, it'll flow out, it'll be clear. God has made this love manifest to us in sending His Son so that we might live through Him. Verse 10, and this is love, not that we've loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be a propitiation for our sins. He came to save us. We remembered that this morning in the blood and the flesh of Christ, like the body of Jesus broken and the blood of Jesus spilled. No one's ever seen God, but if we love one another, God abides in us and love is perfected in us. I love that. No one's seen God, but if we love the way God loves, they will see God in us. This is where God's reflected in the world. You see, God's primarily reflected in the world through His people. And through creation and all sorts of things, but if our lives are flowing with love, then the people will see what love looks like. And as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that this is the fruit that Jesus is looking for in us in Galatians chapter 5, right? He says, if you live according to the flesh, if you grasp and you grab for all you can get in the world, if you live according to your desires, you don't get the kingdom. And I don't think what he's saying there is if you live according to the flesh, you don't get to go to heaven when you die. What he's saying is, if you live according to the flesh, you won't have the abundant life you want and that I want for you. And if you do live according to the Spirit, here's what you get. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, and all the rest, right? Now, think about those words. Those words almost completely have to do with how we relate to each other. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, right? You don't get to see those things for the most part unless you watch them in relationship to each other. If you live according to the Spirit, these are the fruits that will flow out of your life. And I was thinking, it's too bad that Micah didn't turn the list over. Like, what is God looking for from you? To walk humbly, to love mercy, and to do justice. Because here's what I thought about in this text. If we start with humility, the rest is easier. If we start, let's revisit these words for maybe a helpful perspective. If we begin with humility, it's easier. You see, when we see ourselves in contrast to who God is, it's easier to see others better. In other words, when Isaiah looked and he saw God, he said, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, I'm living in a generation of unclean lips because I've seen the Lord of glory. He's saying, compared to who God is, I'm the distance away from God that the earth is from the sun or further. That's what Isaiah is saying. I'm the distance, from God that the earth is from the sun. Start there. Again, not to say I'm awful. You're not awful. God created you. He loves you deeply. He sent His Son to die for you. He doesn't see you as lowly. But understand that compared to the glory of God, we're a million miles from that. Start there. Start by understanding and seeing His glory. Look for His glory. See His beauty and His majesty. And when we see God that way, it's easier to look at others. Here's why. I'm about 6 feet tall. Some of you are shorter than that. Right? Maybe you're 5 feet tall. That means I'm 12 inches taller than you. That makes me pretty tall comparatively. So if I look at you and I'm 6 feet tall and you're only 5 feet tall, I'm going to be like, Yeah, I can't help it, but I'm pretty awesome because I'm 12 inches taller than you. Here's the thing, though. The goal is not to compare myself to you. Because compared to someone who's 5 feet tall, I'm pretty tall. But a person who's 6 feet tall is still a long ways from the sun, in the same way that a person who's 5 feet tall is a long ways from the sun. Does that make sense? You see, the distance from the top of my head to the sun is practically immeasurable. And if you're 5 feet tall, the distance from the top of your head to the sun is the same kind of immeasurable. There's just no difference. And so if we begin with humility, that is to say, if we begin with seeing ourselves first, clearly, then we can look at others and say, well, we're both a long ways from the sun. And our lives are reflecting what they are. And so mercy's easier. Because when we recognize that God has shown us mercy in spite of our weakness, we can also see that God shows others mercy in spite of their weakness. And compared to God, our weakness is all just immeasurable. It's just like it's infinite practically. And so kindness and steadfast love can flow out of the hearts of people who've been forgiven and loved and know who they are compared to God. You see, the point isn't whether you're better than the person you're standing next to or worse than the person standing next to you. The point is that God has loved you with an unfailing love, an immeasurable love, an infinite love, an unconditional love, and He's loved the person next to you the same way too. And if it weren't for that, we would be in trouble. And so don't look at yourself and think, I'm better than the next person. If you do that, you will be arrogant and you'll be proud and you'll be able to judge really easily. But if you look at them in light of God's love, it's harder. And that understands ourselves. We have to see ourselves clearly. And so justice more easily flows out of a place of humility and kindness than out of a place of a hard and arrogant heart. When we see ourselves and don't understand how kindly and how immeasurably we've been loved by God, we don't think of ourselves in those terms, and it's easy to judge and to not behave equitably towards people around us. And so how do we process the world and each other in a way that reflects God's heart to the world around us? Well, it begins with seeing ourselves clearly and understanding His glory and His majesty, and that in the midst of it, still He loves us. To take the heart that He's shown us in loving kindness and mercy and unfailing love, and to love the people around us with that heart, and then to let our justice flow out of that. It's actually what God said He wants from us. And as we talked this year a lot about the idea that when Moses Lake Christian Church is at its best, it's people are engaged in authentic, life-giving relationships. It's difficult to be engaged in authentic, life-giving relationships if we can't see ourselves and see others as God sees us and others. And it's a good place to start. As we launch into 2020, wouldn't it be something if our lives could reflect the sort of kindness that God's looking for in Micah 6:8? He's shown us what He's looking for: to do justice and to love mercy and to walk in this world in humility.